The sea is usually a place of life. For centuries, the Mediterranean Sea was the heartbeat of the world. It was a blue engine of trade, pumping spices, silk, and gold. But in October of 1347, the sea changed its nature. It stopped carrying life and started carrying silence. Imagine a map of the ancient world. Picture the blue water of the Mediterranean. Now, visualize thin, invisible lines connecting every major city. These lines are shipping lanes. A shipping lane is like a highway on the water. It is a specific path that ships follow to get from one port to another safely and quickly. In the 14th century, these lanes were the most important networks on Earth. They made kings rich. They built empires. But a network has a fatal flaw. A network connects everything. And if you can move gold along a line, you can move death along the same line. Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. In this series, we are not just looking at dates and battles. We are tracking a killer on a map. We are going to watch how a microscopic organism hijacked the most sophisticated technology of the Middle Ages, the merchant ship, and used it to conquer a continent. To understand this story and to improve your English, we need to think about nodes and networks. Think of a spider web. The threads are the network. The points where the threads cross are the nodes. In our story, the nodes are the great port cities: Messina, Genoa, Venice, Marseille. These cities were the lungs of Europe. They breathed in ships from the east and breathed out goods to the west. But before the ships arrived in Italy, the trouble began much further away. We must travel to the edge of the known world. We must go to the Crimean Peninsula. The year is 1346. The location is the city of Caffa. Caffa was a wealthy trading post on the Black Sea. Today, this area is near Feodosia in Crimea. Back then, it was a fortress controlled by traders from Genoa, Italy. The Genoese were master sailors. They were business people. They had built a massive wall around Caffa to protect their warehouses. Outside those walls, a massive army was waiting. This was the army of the Golden Horde, a powerful segment of the Mongol Empire. They were led by a Khan named Janibeg. This is a classic siege. In English history, a siege is a military operation where an army surrounds a town or building, cutting off essential supplies to force those inside to surrender. The word comes from an old French word meaning seat. The army sits down and waits. The Mongol army had been sitting outside Caffa for a long time. The tension was high. The Genoese sailors inside were trapped. They looked over the walls and saw thousands of tents. They smelled the smoke of campfires. They heard the drums of war. But then, the sound of the drums changed. The Genoese defenders noticed something strange. The attacks stopped. The shouting died down. Instead of charging the walls, the Mongol soldiers were collapsing. A mysterious illness was tearing through the besieging army. Men were dying by the thousands. This is where biology meets geography. The bacteria, Yersinia pestis, had traveled along the Silk Road, the overland trade route from Asia, and found a new host in the Mongol camp. The Khan, Janibeg, was furious. His army was dissolving before his eyes. He could not capture the city with swords, so he decided to use the sickness itself. According to the account of a notary named Gabriele de Musi, a terrifying order was given. The Mongol engines of war, the catapults, were loaded. But they were not loaded with stones or fire. They were loaded with the bodies of the dead soldiers. The catapults launched the infected corpses over the high walls of Caffa. This moment is disputed by some modern historians, but it remains one of the most vivid images in history. Imagine the horror inside the city. The defenders were prepared for arrows. They were not prepared for rain of dead bodies. The infection breached the perimeter. A perimeter is the outer boundary of a closed area. Once the biological perimeter was broken, the city of Caffa was doomed. The Genoese traders panicked. They realized the city was lost, not to the army, but to the invisible enemy. They ran to the harbor. Let's focus on that word, harbor. A harbor is a sheltered body of water where ships can anchor safely. It is a place of refuge. But in this story, the harbor becomes a trap. The sailors scrambled onto their galleys. A galley is a type of ship propelled mainly by rowing. These were the speedboats of the Middle Ages. They had sails, but they also had banks of oarsmen. They unmoored the ships. To unmoor means to release the ropes that hold a ship to the dock. They desperately wanted to escape the horror of Caffa. They wanted to go home to Italy. As the galleys rowed away from the burning, screaming city, the sailors felt a sense of relief. They breathed the fresh, salty air of the Black Sea. They thought they had left the danger behind. They were wrong. They had brought the danger with them. Down in the dark holds of the ships, amidst the grain and the furs, rats were hiding. And on the rats were fleas, and inside the fleas was the bacteria. The ships entered the shipping lanes. They moved from the Black Sea through the narrow Bosphorus Strait and into the Mediterranean. They were moving swiftly toward the heart of Europe. This brings us to a critical concept in geography: the corridor. A corridor is a long passage in a building from which doors lead into rooms. In geography, a transport corridor is a linear area that is defined by one or more modes of transport, like a road, a rail line, or in this case, a sea lane. The Genoese ships were traveling down a corridor of water. They were not just carrying refugees. They were carrying a biological time bomb. For days, the ships sailed west. The sun beat down on the wooden decks. Slowly, the sailors began to feel tired. They developed fevers. Swellings appeared on their bodies, grotesque black lumps in the armpits and groins. These were the buboes, the signature of the plague. The crew began to die. The ships became floating hearses. But the ships did not stop. The wind pushed them forward. The currents carried them toward the next node in the network. This is the tragedy of a highly connected world. Efficiency is good for trade, but it is excellent for infection. The faster a ship moves, the further the disease can travel before it kills the crew. If the voyage had taken months, the crew might have all died at sea, and the ship would have drifted harmlessly. But the Genoese galleys were fast. They approached the island of Sicily. Sicily is the football at the toe of Italy's boot. It sits right in the center of the Mediterranean. It is a perfect stopping point for ships. The port city of Messina is on the northeast corner of Sicily. In October 1347, the people of Messina looked out at the horizon. They saw ships approaching. They were happy. Ships meant business. Ships meant news. Ships meant money. The dock workers prepared the ropes. The merchants prepared their coins. The families prepared to welcome their fathers and brothers home. They did not know that they were watching the end of their world approach from the horizon. When a ship comes into a port, we use the verb dock. To dock is to bring a ship into a harbor and tie it up. Another useful phrase is make port, which simply means to arrive at the destination. The Genoese galleys made port in Messina. The ropes were thrown. The gangplanks were lowered. The people of Messina rushed forward. But as they boarded the ships, they recoiled in horror. They found dead men at the oars. They found dying men on the decks, covered in black, oozing sores. The smell was unbearable. The Messinians quickly realized their mistake. They tried to push the ships away. They tried to cut the ropes, but it was too late. The rats had already scurried down the ropes. The fleas had already jumped onto the dock workers. The contact had been made. The node, Messina, was now infected. From this single point, the entire network of Europe began to light up, not with trade, but with fever. In this series, we are going to track this movement. We will watch how the infection moved from the coast, the land next to the sea, to the inland, the areas far away from the sea. We will learn the language of movement. Words like disembark, transmit, ascend, and penetrate. We will see how a biological spark in Caffa caused a fire that burned from Sicily to Scotland. But right now, we are standing on the docks of Messina in October 1347. The first sailors are stumbling onto the cobblestones. The clock has started. The great Mortality has arrived in Europe. And the network that made Europe rich is about to tear it apart. Fear is faster than any ship. While a galley can travel at perhaps 4 or 5 knots, a rumor travels at the speed of a scream. In Messina, the realization hit instantly. The ships were not bringing wealth. They were bringing the apocalypse. The reaction of the city was brutal and immediate. The officials ordered the Genoese galleys to leave. They wanted to expel the visitors. To expel means to force someone to leave a place or an organization. It is a strong verb. You can expel a student from school. You can expel air from your lungs. And in 1347, Messina tried to expel death from its harbor. The ropes were cut. The weary, dying sailors were forced back to their oars. The galleys drifted out of the harbor, expelled into the open sea again. They were now ghost ships, wandering the Mediterranean, looking for a place to die. But for Sicily, the damage was already done. You cannot expel a microbe that has already disembarked. The rats were on shore. The fleas were biting. And just as importantly, the people of Messina began to do the one thing that guarantees a pandemic will spread. They ran away. This introduces a crucial concept in the geography of disease: the relationship between the port and the hinterland. We know what a port is, but what is a hinterland? The prefix hinter comes from German, meaning behind. The hinterland is the land behind the port. It is the inland region that supplies the port with goods and people. The port is the door. The hinterland is the house. When the plague struck Messina, the wealthy citizens fled into the hinterland. They grabbed their children and their gold and rode horses toward the city of Catania further south. They thought they were escaping the pestilence of the port. They were wrong. They were the transport vehicles. A witness from the time, Michael Platiensis, described it vividly. He wrote that people from Messina arrived in Catania and were so contagious that anyone who even spoke to them died. The infection moved from the coastal node, Messina, into the agricultural network, the rest of Sicily. The roads filled with refugees. And everywhere the refugees stopped, an inn, a tavern, a cousin's house, the silence followed days later. Meanwhile, out on the dark water, the expelled ships were still moving. They were desperate. They needed water. They needed food. They turned their bows north, toward their home city, Genoa. Genoa is located in northwestern Italy. It was a superpower of the sea. It was the headquarters of the sailors who had been at Caffa. These men were trying to get home, but the news had traveled faster than the ships. The authorities in Genoa had heard about the disaster in the east. When the death ships appeared on the horizon, the Genoese leadership made a cold calculation. They launched burning arrows and war galleys to block the harbor entrance. They refused to let their own brothers dock. To dock means to bring a ship into the landing area. Genoa forbade it. The ships were turned away again. Take a moment to imagine the psychological horror on those ships. You are sick. You are dying. You have rowed across the entire Mediterranean. You can see your home city, the bell towers, the roofs of your own house. But you are forced to turn around and die at sea. However, historians suggest that while the main fleet was blocked, some smaller vessels may have slipped through down the coast, or perhaps carriers traveled overland from other ports. The blockage was not perfect. The infection found a crack in the armor. It entered the Italian mainland. The word mainland refers to the large continuous extent of land that includes the greater part of a country or territory, as opposed to offshore islands like Sicily. Once the plague hits the mainland, it has no natural borders. It can walk all the way to Denmark. But the main fleet of infected galleys had one final destination. Rejected by Sicily, rejected by Genoa, they drifted west toward France. They approached the port of Marseille. Marseille was the great southern gate of France. It was a bustling, chaotic, ancient city. Unlike Genoa, Marseille did not have advanced warning. Or perhaps they were just too greedy to turn away a fleet of cargo ships. In November 1347, the ships glided into the harbor of Marseille. The authorities allowed the sailors to disembark. Disembark is the opposite of embark. Bark comes from an old word for a ship. To embark is to get on. To disembark is to get off. The 6 sailors disembarked. The rats disembarked. The cargo was unloaded. The trap snapped shut. Within days, the hospitals in Marseille were full. Then the churches were full. Then the graveyards were full. The city panicked. They finally expelled the ships, just like Messina had done. But again, it was too late. Now, look at the map in your mind. We have 3 bright red dots glowing on the coast of the Mediterranean. Messina, the island entry. Genoa, the northern Italian entry. Marseille, the French entry. These are the primary nodes. From these 3 points, the disease began to move differently. It no longer needed ships. It switched its mode of transport. It moved from maritime routes, sea, to terrestrial routes, land. It began to follow the trade corridors. In the Middle Ages, trade routes were like rivers. They flowed along specific valleys and roads. From Marseille, a massive corridor runs north up the Rhône River Valley. This is the highway into the heart of France. The plague was about to meet the papacy. At this time, the Pope was not in Rome. He was living in a city called Avignon, just north of Marseille. Avignon was crowded, rich, and holy. It was the perfect feast for the bacteria. As the winter of 1347 turned into 1348, the temperature dropped. Usually diseases slow down in winter. But the Black Death was different. It adapted. It found warm homes inside thatched roofs and woolen cloaks. The nodes and networks were working perfectly. The port cities acted as the injection points. The roads acted as the veins, and the blood was pumping north. In the next part, we will leave the sea behind. We will travel inland, up the rivers, and witness how the infection conquered the church. We will see what happens when a pope locks himself in a ring of fire to survive. The coast is lost. The interior is next. The sea is a vast open plain, but a river is a road that moves. We left the infection in the port of Marseille. The ships had stopped, but the cargo had not. In the 14th century, heavy goods did not travel by wagon if they could help it. Muddy roads were slow and dangerous. Water was the superhighway. So, the goods were transferred from the ocean galleys onto flat-bottomed river barges. These barges moved upstream. Let's look at two essential directional words: upstream and downstream. To go downstream is easy. You float with the current toward the sea. To go upstream is hard. You must fight against the current to go inland. The plague moved upstream. It fought the current of the Rhone River, pushed by the hunger of commerce. It was heading for the most important city in the region, Avignon. In 1348, Avignon was not just a French town. It was the center of the world. The Catholic Church had moved its headquarters there. It was a city of palaces, gold, and bureaucrats. It was incredibly dense. Dense means crowded or compacted. A forest can be dense with trees. A city can be dense with people. Avignon was dense with everything: pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, and rats. It was the perfect biological reactor. When the barges from Marseille docked at the riverbanks of Avignon, the invisible passenger disembarked again. The infection infiltrated the narrow streets. In January 1348, the Great Mortality exploded in Avignon. The death rate was catastrophic. Historians estimate that up to 50% of the population of Avignon died in just a few months. Imagine the sound of that city. Usually it was filled with church bells and market cries. Now, it was filled with the digging of graves. The cemeteries were so full that Pope Clement VI consecrated the entire Rhone River as a burial ground. They threw the bodies directly into the water. Think about the network implications of that. The river, which was the source of water and transport, had become a conveyor belt of corpses flowing back downstream. But inside the papal palace, a fortress with thick stone walls, a strange drama was unfolding. Pope Clement VI was a man of science and luxury. He did not flee like the citizens of Messina. He stayed. But he was terrified. His personal physician was a brilliant surgeon named Guy de Chauliac. Guy de Chauliac is a hero of medical history. While others ran, he stayed to treat the sick. He caught the plague himself and survived, leaving us one of the most accurate descriptions of the symptoms. He advised the Pope to do something radical. He told Clement to isolate himself completely. The Pope locked himself in his private chambers. This introduces the concept of a barrier. A barrier is an obstacle that prevents movement or access. A wall is a physical barrier. A law can be a legal barrier. The Pope built a barrier of fire. He ordered 2 massive bonfires to be built inside his room. He sat between them, sweating in the heat of the French summer, day and night. He did not allow anyone to approach him. At the time, they believed the disease was caused by miasma, bad air. They thought the fire would purify the air. In reality, the heat likely created a thermal barrier that kept the fleas away. Fleas do not like extreme heat. The Pope survived because he broke the network of contact. He created a dead zone around himself where the vector, the flea, could not enter. This is a lesson in containment. To contain means to keep something harmful within limits. The Pope contained himself to survive, but the city outside could not be contained. From Avignon, the disease did not stop. It used the city as a hub. A hub is the central part of a wheel where the spokes connect. In transport geography, a hub is a central point where goods and people are distributed. Avignon was a hub for the church. Messengers left the city every day to carry letters to England, Germany, and Spain. Each messenger was a potential carrier. The infection followed the Rhône Valley further north. It reached the city of Lyon. Lyon is a confluence. A confluence is the point where 2 rivers meet. At Lyon, the Rhône meets the Saône. When a virus or a bacteria hits a confluence, it splits. One branch went east toward the Alps. The other branch went north toward Paris. The geography of Europe was acting like a roadmap for the disease. The valleys channeled the infection. The mountains blocked it, temporarily. We see a clear pattern now. Entry, port cities, Messina, Marseille. Corridor, river valleys, the Rhône. Hub, major administrative centers, Avignon. The speed was terrifying. A merchant could travel 30 kilometers a day. The plague traveled with him. It moved faster than any army in history because it didn't need supply lines. It ate the hosts it traveled with. By the summer of 1348, the pestilence had broken out of the Mediterranean box. It was no longer a coastal problem. It was a continental disaster. In the north, the King of France, Philip VI, watched the reports coming from the south. He saw the Black Death eating his kingdom mile by mile. He ordered prayers. He ordered processions. But you cannot pray away a flea. The road to Paris was open. In the next part, we will leave the heat of the south and travel to the cool, damp streets of Paris, and then cross the English Channel. We will learn how the disease crossed the water again. Not via the Mediterranean this time, but across the narrow sea that protects England. We will look at the word strait and the concept of insularity. Does living on an island save you, or does it just trap you? In the medieval world, there was a saying, all roads lead to Rome. But in France, all roads and all rivers eventually lead to Paris. By the summer of 1348, the infection had left the warm Mediterranean far behind. It had traveled north up the Rhône Valley, crossed the land gap, and found a new river system, the Seine. This brings us to a beautiful but deadly geographical concept: convergence. To converge means to come together from different directions to meet at one point. The opposite is to diverge, to move apart. In 1348, everything converged on Paris. It was the largest city in northern Europe. It was a magnet for grain, for wine, for cloth, and for people. Over 100,000 souls lived packed inside its walls. If Avignon was dense, Paris was a solid block of humanity. The streets were narrow, winding canyons of mud and timber. Sunlight barely touched the ground. In these dark, damp alleys, the rats did not just survive, they thrived. When the plague arrived in Paris in August 1348, it didn't just knock on the door, it flooded the city. The King of France, Philip VI, saw the convergence of death. Like the nobles in Sicily, he chose movement as his defense. He abandoned his capital. He moved his court to the countryside, hoping that distance would save him. But the city of Paris could not move. The artisans, the bakers, the priests, they were trapped in the urban core. The core is the center or most important part of something. The apple has a core. A city has a core. The urban core of Paris became a graveyard. The king's own wife, Queen Joan of Burgundy, did not escape. She died of the pestilence, proving that the disease did not care about royalty. It only cared about biology. But the infection was not satisfied with France. It had a new target. It looked north, toward the gray, choppy waters of the English Channel. This body of water is a strait. A strait, spelled S-T-R-A-I-T, is a narrow passage of water connecting two seas or two other large areas of water. The Strait of Dover connects the North Sea to the English Channel. It is only about 30 kilometers wide. On a clear day, you can stand in France and see the white cliffs of England. For centuries, the English people believed in their insularity. This is a powerful word. Insularity comes from the Latin word insula, meaning island. To be insular means to be isolated, separate, or protected by the sea. Geographically, Britain is an island. The people felt safe. They thought the Great Pestilence was a continental problem. They thought the salt water would wash it away. They forgot one thing. Trade bridges the gap. The English controlled a large part of France called Gascony. Ships were constantly crossing the Channel, carrying wine from Bordeaux to England. In June 1348, a ship, likely from Gascony, approached the southern coast of England. It did not go to London immediately. It headed for a small port in the county of Dorset. The port was called Melcombe Regis, now part of the town of Weymouth. It was a quiet summer day. The sea was calm. The ship navigated the harbor entrance. To navigate means to plan and direct the route or course of a ship, aircraft, or other form of transportation. The ship docked. The sailors came ashore. One of them was sick. This moment is historically debated, but the consensus is clear. Melcombe Regis was the gateway. A gateway is an opening that can be closed by a gate, but metaphorically, it is any entry point into a new region. Once the bacteria crossed the gateway of Melcombe Regis, the insularity of England was broken. The island was no longer a fortress. It was a prison. The plague moved quickly inland from the coast. It followed the old Roman roads. These roads were straight, paved, and efficient. The Romans had built them to move armies. Now the rats used them to move death. The disease hit the city of Bristol, a major port, and exploded. From Bristol, it moved toward the ultimate prize, London. London in 1348 was a city of wood and straw. It was built along the River Thames. It was noisy, dirty, and incredibly rich. The English authorities tried to stay calm. They had heard rumors from France. The Bishop of Bath and Wells wrote a letter in August, warning his people that a catastrophic pestilence was coming from the east. He ordered barefoot processions. He ordered prayers. But he did not order a quarantine. The word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. It was a system later developed in places like Venice to keep ships waiting at anchor for 40 days to see if the crew died. In 1348 England, they did not have this word yet. They had no system to stop the flow. The infection crept closer to London. It moved from village to village. It stopped the church bells from ringing because there was no one left to pull the ropes. By autumn 1348, the plague was standing at the gates of London. The King of England, Edward III, was about to face an enemy he could not fight with a sword. The Black Death had completed a journey of thousands of miles, from the steppes of Asia to across the Black Sea to through the Mediterranean to up the rivers of France to across the English Channel to and on to the muddy banks of the Thames. The network was complete. The circuit was closed. In the next part, we will enter London. We will see how a medieval megacity collapses. We will learn the language of mortality and burial. We will see how society tries to function when the workforce disappears. We will also look at a strange phenomenon, the golden age of the laborer that followed the disaster. Because when people die, labor becomes expensive. London is a city defined by its river. The Thames is a brown, muscular snake that winds through the city. In November 1348, the river was cold. The fog, what Londoners call a pea souper, hung low over the water. The plague had arrived. It came on the small coastal barges carrying wool and grain up the river. It docked at the wharves near the Tower of London. And just like in Messina, Genoa, and Marseille, the rats disembarked. London was not ready. The city was a labyrinth of wooden houses leaning over narrow, muddy lanes. There was no sanitation. There were no sewers. People threw their waste into the street. It was a buffet for the rats. The infection moved with terrifying speed from the riverbanks into the slums. A slum is a squalid and overcrowded urban street or district inhabited by very poor people. In the slums of London, entire families lived in single rooms. When one person coughed, everyone was doomed. This brings us to a grim but necessary word: mortality. Mortality refers to the state of being subject to death. In demographics, the mortality rate is the measure of the number of deaths in a particular population. In late 1348, the mortality rate in London skyrocketed. It is estimated that 40% to 50% of the city's population died within months. The churchyards, the small cemeteries next to the churches, filled up instantly. The ground could not hold the bodies. The priests could not say the prayers fast enough. In fact, the priests were dying faster than their parishioners because they visited the sick to give the last rites. The authorities had to improvise. They bought land outside the city walls to create emergency burial grounds. One of the most famous was at East Smithfield. If you visit London today, near the Tower Hill tube station, you are walking over this history. In 1348, this was a field where they dug massive trenches. A trench is a long, narrow ditch. They did not have time for individual graves. They stacked the bodies in the trenches in layers, like firewood. This is a mass grave. Archaeologists have excavated East Smithfield. They found hundreds of skeletons neatly arranged. This shows that even in the apocalypse, Londoners tried to maintain some order. They didn't just dump the bodies, they placed them with respect. But the city went silent. The markets were empty. The workshops were locked. This silence created a new economic reality. It introduces the most powerful concept in economics: scarcity. Scarcity is the state of being in short supply. When something is scarce, it becomes valuable. Suddenly, people were scarce. Before the plague, England was full of peasants. A peasant is a poor farmer of low social status. They worked the land for the lords. They had no power. If a peasant didn't want to work for a penny a day, the lord could just fire him and hire the next starving man. Labor was cheap because people were plentiful. But after the Black Death, the equation flipped. The fields were full of rotting crops because there was no one to harvest them. The sheep were wandering aimlessly because the shepherds were dead. The surviving lords were desperate. They needed labor. Labor is work, especially hard physical work. It also refers to the group of people who do this work, the workforce. The lords went to the surviving peasants and said, "Work for me." The peasants looked around. They saw that they were the only ones left. They realized their value. They said, "No, pay me double." This was a shock to the medieval system. For centuries, the rich held all the power. Now, the poor held the power of refusal. They demanded higher wages. They demanded better food. They demanded freedom from the feudal system that tied them to the land. The Great Mortality had accidentally created a golden age for the survivor. King Edward III was furious. He saw the social order crumbling. In 1349, he issued a law called the Ordinance of Laborers. He tried to freeze wages. To freeze in this context means to fix prices or wages at a specific level and forbid them from rising. The king commanded that everyone must work for the same low wages as they did in 1346. But you cannot legislate against supply and demand. The law failed. The peasants simply walked away to the next village, where a different lord would pay them more. The mobility of the workforce had begun. Mobility is the ability to move or be moved freely and easily. Before the plague, a peasant was born, lived, and died in the same 5-mile radius. After the plague, they moved to where the money was. The geography of England changed. Villages that had existed for hundreds of years were abandoned. These are known today as Deserted Medieval Villages, DMV. You can still see the grassy bumps in the English countryside where houses used to stand. The people died or moved away, and the village was erased from the map. The infection had done more than kill bodies. It had killed the feudal system. The nodes, cities, were broken. The networks, feudal obligations, were snapped. London eventually recovered, but it was a different city. It was younger, angrier, and more mobile. But the story does not end in England. The plague had momentum. It did not stop at the Atlantic Ocean. It turned back toward the center of Europe. It moved into Germany, Scandinavia, and even toward Russia. In the next part, we will look at the periphery. We will travel to the edges of Europe, to Norway and Poland. we will see a ship drift into Bergen with a dead crew, bringing the end of the Viking Age. And we will ask a controversial question. Did some places escape? We will look at the miracle of the Milanese quarantine and the isolation of Poland. The map is almost entirely red, but there are still a few green spots left. In the summer of 1349, the people of Bergen, Norway, saw a ship on the horizon. It was a trading vessel from England. But something was wrong. It was not sailing in a straight line. It was drifting. To drift means to be carried slowly by a current of air or water without control. The ship was moving aimlessly. The sails were flapping loosely in the wind. The locals of Bergen were curious. They rowed out to the ship. They climbed aboard. They found the crew dead. The captain was slumped over the wheel. The sailors were scattered on the deck. The Norwegians saw the cargo. The ship was full of English wool and cloth. This was valuable. They decided to salvage the goods. Salvage is a specific verb used in maritime law. It means to rescue a wrecked or disabled ship or its cargo from loss at sea. They unloaded the wool. They carried the bales onto the docks of Bergen. They celebrated their luck. They did not know that the wool was full of fleas. Within days, Bergen was dying. This tragedy illustrates the concept of the periphery. The periphery refers to the outer limits or edge of an area or object. In 1348, London and Paris were the core. Norway was the periphery. But because of the shipping networks, the periphery was connected to the core. The disease traveled all the way to the edge of the known world. From Bergen, the plague moved inland into the valleys of Norway. It was devastating. Farms became silent. The forest grew back over the fields. But let's look at the map again. While the disease was conquering the north, something strange was happening in the south and east. There were two places that seemed to resist the tide. Let's travel back to Italy, to the city of Milan. Milan is a powerful city in the north of Italy. While Florence, Venice, and Genoa were being destroyed, Milan had a different experience. The death rate was much lower. Why? The answer lies in the ruthlessness of its rulers, the Visconti family. When the first cases of plague appeared in Milan, the archbishop and the lords did not pray. They did not flee. They took immediate, brutal action. They ordered the houses of the infected to be walled up. To wall up means to close an opening with a wall of bricks or stone. If a family fell sick, the soldiers came. They did not take the sick to a hospital. They bricked up the doors and windows of the house, with the healthy family members still inside. They left them there to die or survive on their own. It was cruel. It was terrifying. But it was an effective quarantine. By sealing the nodes, the houses, completely, they broke the network of transmission. Milan became a fortress of health in a sea of death. Now, look east. Look at the Kingdom of Poland. On many historical maps of the Black Death, you will see a massive spread of red infection. But right in the center of Europe, there is often a patch of green. This is Poland. Historians have debated this for decades. Did Poland really escape? Recent evidence suggests it wasn't a total miracle. People did die. But the mortality rate was significantly lower than in France or England. Why? The answer is partly geographical and partly political. King Casimir the Great was a smart ruler. He realized that the danger was coming from the west. He decided to isolate his kingdom. To isolate means to cause a person or place to be or remain alone or apart from others. He closed the borders. He restricted travel. He set up internal cordons. A cordon is a line or circle of police, soldiers, or guards preventing access to or from an area. He stopped the merchants. He stopped the pilgrims. Also, Poland had fewer urban centers, large cities, than Western Europe. The population was more spread out. The nodes were smaller, and the networks were thinner. The rats had to travel longer distances between meals. This brings us to the word spare. To spare means to refrain from killing, injuring, or distressing. We often say, the plague spared Poland. It didn't spare them completely, but it missed the heart of the country. So we have a contrast. Norway, the periphery, was hit because it was connected by sea. Poland, the periphery, was spared because it disconnected itself by land. The lesson here is about connectivity. Connectivity is the state or extent of being connected or interconnected. In the 14th century, high connectivity meant high wealth. But in a pandemic, high connectivity meant high death. The places that were backward or isolated suddenly became the safest places on Earth. By 1350, the plague had completed a massive loop. It had traveled north to Scandinavia, east to the border of Russia, south to the Mediterranean. It was beginning to burn itself out. The fire was running out of fuel. The population of Europe had dropped by at least 1/3. In some places, 60% of the people were gone. But the story of the Black Death is not just about the years of dying. It is about what came after. It is about the aftermath. Aftermath refers to the consequences or after-effects of a significant, unpleasant event. The aftermath of the plague was a world turned upside down. The survivors looked around. They saw empty houses. They saw empty fields. And they saw something else. Opportunity. In the next part, we will look at the legacy of the plague. We will see how the English language itself changed. We will see how the relationship between God and man changed. And we will watch the final, slow movement of the disease into the vast plains of Russia, completing the circle of destruction. The great mortality was ending. The Renaissance was about to begin. But first, we must bury the dead. A circle has no beginning and no end, but a journey must eventually close its loop. By 1351, the Black Death had traveled north through Germany, across the Baltic Sea to Scandinavia, and then it turned southeast. It marched into the vast, snowy plains of Russia. It reached the city of Novgorod, and then Moscow. In a terrifying twist of geography, the disease had returned almost to where it started. It had begun near the Black Sea, traveled west to the Atlantic, north to the Arctic, and now came back to the east. It completed the circuit. A circuit is a roughly circular line, route, or movement that starts and finishes at the same place. An electrical circuit powers a light. This biological circuit powered a catastrophe. But as the disease burned out in Russia, Europe was waking up. The fever broke. The survivors opened their doors. They looked at the world, and it was different. The first thing they noticed was the silence. The second thing they noticed was the opportunity. Let's go back to England. Before the plague, the official language of the law courts was French. The language of the church and schools was Latin. English was considered a vulgar tongue, the language of the uneducated. But the plague was not a snob. It killed the French-speaking aristocrats and the Latin-speaking priests just as easily as it killed the English-speaking plowmen. Suddenly, there were no teachers left. A chronicler named John Trevisa wrote about this shift. He noted that after the first pestilence, masters in grammar schools stopped teaching in French. They switched to the vernacular. Vernacular refers to the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people in a particular country or region. In England, the vernacular was English. Because the experts were dead, the common language took over. In 1362, the king decreed that English could be used in the courts of law. The plague had accidentally liberated the English language. Without the Black Death, Shakespeare might have written in French. This is a lesson in disruption. Disruption is a disturbance or problem that interrupts an event, activity, or process. Usually, we think of disruption as bad. But in history, massive disruption often leads to innovation. The old system breaks, and a new one fills the void. The same thing happened to the social structure. We talked about labor in Part 5. Now let's talk about leverage. Leverage is the power to influence a person or situation to achieve a particular outcome. It comes from the word lever, a tool used to lift heavy objects. Before 1348, the lords had all the leverage. They owned the land. After 1350, the peasants had the leverage. They owned the labor. The lords tried to stop them. They passed laws to force peasants to stay on the land. But the peasants realized they could just leave. They became migrant. A migrant is a person who moves from one place to another, especially in order to find work or better living conditions. Workers moved from the countryside to the cities. The cities, which had been death traps, now became engines of freedom. If a peasant could stay in a city for a year and a day, he was legally free from his lord. The cities needed people to replace the dead, so they welcomed the runaways. This movement from the rural, country, to the urban, city, is called urbanization. The plague accelerated urbanization. It emptied the villages and filled the towns. But the most profound change was inside the human mind. Imagine walking into a church in 1352. You look at the walls. Before the plague, the paintings were of saints, angels, and heaven. Now the art began to change. The painters started to draw skeletons. They drew corpses dancing with kings. They drew worms eating bishops. This new style was called the danse macabre, the dance of death. It was a visual lesson in equality. It told the viewer, rich or poor, powerful or weak, you will all join the dance. This brings us to the word secular. Secular denotes attitudes, activities, or other things that have no religious or spiritual basis. Society became slightly more secular. People still believed in God, but they had lost faith in the church as an institution. The priests had died just like the sinners. The prayers hadn't worked. The survivors began to focus more on this life rather than the next life. They wanted to eat better food, wear better clothes, and build better houses now. This shift in thinking, from focusing on heaven to focusing on earth, planted the seeds for the Renaissance. So, The nodes and networks that carried the disease also carried the cure for the Middle Ages. The ships brought the rat, but the rat brought the end of feudalism. In the next part, we will look at the succession. We will see how the plague returned. It wasn't a one-time event. It came back in 1361, 1369, and every decade for centuries. We will learn the word endemic, and we will see how Europe adapted to living with a serial killer in its house. We have seen the circuit close. Now we must see how the wheel keeps turning. We often think of a disaster as a single event. A bomb explodes, a hurricane hits, then the rebuilding begins. But the Black Death was not a single event. It was a serial killer that learned the layout of the house. In 1351, the survivors of the Great Mortality took a deep breath. They repaired the roofs. They married quickly. They had babies. They thought the nightmare was over. They were wrong. 10 years later, in 1361, the sickness returned. This outbreak was known as the Secunda Pestis, the second pestilence. But the people gave it a much sadder name: the Children's Plague. This name reveals a cruel biological reality. The adults who had survived the first wave in 1348 had acquired immunity. Immunity is the ability of an organism to resist a particular infection or toxin. Because the older generation had already faced the bacteria and lived, their bodies knew how to fight it. They were safe. But the children born after 1350 had no memory of the disease. Their bodies were naive. The network of infection found a new path of least resistance: the playgrounds and the nurseries. This brings us to a critical medical and geographical concept: endemic. When a disease is epidemic, it is a sudden, widespread outbreak. When a disease is pandemic, it spreads across whole countries or the world. But when a disease becomes endemic, it is regularly found among particular people or in a certain area. The plague had become endemic in Europe. It had moved in permanently. It retreated into the shadows, into the rat populations of the cities, and waited. Every 10 or 12 years, 1361, 1369, 1375, the population would grow large enough to feed the fire again. Then, the disease would recur. To recur means to occur again, periodically or repeatedly. This creates a cycle. The population rises, the plague recurs, the population falls. For the next 300 years, Europe was trapped in this cycle. So, how do you live with a killer in your house? You change the architecture. The port cities, which were the first to die, were the first to adapt. They realized that they could not stop the trade networks, but they could filter them. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, Croatia, invented a new kind of node. They passed a law. Any ship arriving from a plague-ridden area had to stop at a nearby island. They had to wait there for 1 month before they could enter the city. This was not just a panic reaction. It was a policy. It was the birth of the lazaretto. A lazaretto is an isolation hospital or station for people with infectious diseases, especially leprosy or plague. Later, Venice built the first permanent plague hospital on an island in its lagoon. This changed the geography of the port. Before, the harbor was an open mouth. Now the harbor had a filter. The lazaretto became a mandatory stop in the network. If you wanted to trade, you had to wait. The English language adapted to this new reality of waiting and succession. Consider the word succession. Succession refers to a number of people or things sharing a specified characteristic and following one after the other. We talk about the succession of kings, but in the 14th century they dealt with a succession of plagues. This constant pressure changed the psychology of the cities. Since death could return at any moment, the people became obsessed with legacy. Legacy is an amount of money or property left to someone in a will. It is also something that is a part of your history, or that remains from an earlier time. Merchants knew they might die young, so they founded schools. They built chantries, chapels. They endowed colleges at Oxford and Cambridge. They wanted to leave a mark that the plague could not erase. Paradoxically, the recurring plague kept Europe rich. Remember the labor shortage? Because the plague kept killing the population every 20 years, the population of Europe did not recover to its pre-1348 levels until the 16th century. This meant there were always fewer people than there was land. Wages remained high. The golden age of the peasant lasted for generations, simply because the workers kept dying. The network of trade continued, but the nodes became harder. The cities built higher walls. They paved their streets to reduce filth. They hired plague doctors with beak masks to visit the sick. The beak mask is famous, but it was actually invented much later, in the 17th century. However, the idea started here, that you could build a barrier between yourself and the air. By 1400, the Black Death was no longer a surprise. It was a season. Just as you have a harvest season and a planting season, you had a plague season. The terror had become routine. In the next part, we will look at the culmination. We will fast forward to the end of this era. We will see how the Great Fire of London in 1666 finally helped to cleanse the city, and how the brown rat replaced the black rat. We will look at the word displace, and we will see how science finally began to catch up with superstition. The microscope was coming. The flea's days were numbered. Water brought the plague to Europe. Fire drove it out. For 3 centuries, the Black Death had been the unwanted tenant of London. It lived in the walls. It lived under the floorboards. It lived in the thatched roofs where the black rats built their nests. But in 1665, the plague struck London with a ferocity that recalled the terror of 1348. This was the Great Plague of London. It killed 100,000 people, merely a quarter of the city. The nodes were overwhelmed. The networks of charity collapsed. Then, the summer of 1666 arrived. It was hot and dry. The wooden city was like a pile of kindling waiting for a spark. That spark came on September 2nd in a bakery on Pudding Lane. The Great Fire of London is often remembered as a tragedy, but for public health, it was a culmination. Culmination is the highest or climactic point of something, especially as attained after a long time. The fire was the culmination of the medieval city. It burned for days. It destroyed 13,000 houses. It melted the lead off the roof of St. Paul's Cathedral. But it also burned the slums. It incinerated the filth. It sterilized the streets. When the smoke cleared, the habitat of the black rat was gone. The narrow, dark alleys were ash. The city had to be rebuilt. This introduces the concept of sanitation. Sanitation refers to the conditions relating to public health, especially the provision of clean drinking water and adequate sewage disposal. When King Charles II and the architect Christopher Wren planned the New London, they prioritized sanitation. They widened the streets. They built with brick and stone, not wood and straw. Brick does not rot. Brick does not have holes for rats to hide in. The new architecture created a barrier that the rodents could not cross. But there was another invader arriving at the docks, one that would help end the plague, ironically. Meet the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. For centuries, the black rat, Rattus rattus, had been the master of the ship and the house. The black rat was a climber. It liked to live in roofs and attics, close to humans. It was the perfect bus for the plague flea. But in the early 18th century, the brown rat arrived from Asia. It traveled on the new, larger trading ships. The brown rat was bigger, stronger, and more aggressive. It was a ground dweller. It lived in sewers and cellars, away from human touch. The brown rat began to displace the black rat. To displace means to take over the place, position, or role of someone or something. The brown rat fought the black rat and won. It pushed the black rat out of the cities. This ecological shift was crucial. The brown rat carried fleas, but it didn't like to live in the ceiling above your bed. It lived in the wet, cold drains. The vector, the flea, was moved further away from the human host. A vector is an organism, typically a biting insect or tick, that transmits a disease or parasite from one animal or plant to another. When the vector was displaced, the chain of transmission was broken. The nodes, cities, were now built of stone. The networks, sewers, were underground. The agents, black rats, were exiled. The plague did not vanish from the earth. It still exists today in parts of the world. But it could no longer find a comfortable home in the capitals of Europe. The great mortality had lost its passport. However, humanity was not just relying on luck and aggressive rats. We were beginning to use a new weapon: observation. In the Netherlands, a draper named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek was playing with lenses. He built a simple microscope. He looked at a drop of water. He saw tiny animalcules swimming in it. He was the first human to see bacteria. He did not know that these tiny creatures caused the plague. That discovery, the identification of Yersinia pestis, would not happen until 1894 by Alexander Yersin. But the door to the invisible world had been opened. We moved from the age of superstition to the age of empiricism. Empiricism is the theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. In science, it means testing and observing rather than just guessing or praying. The doctors stopped talking about miasma, bad air, and started looking at microbes. So, as the 17th century turned into the 18th, the map of Europe changed again. The red zones of infection faded. The ports became gateways of commerce, not just corridors of death. The journey that started with a catapult in Caffa and a galley in Messina was finally over. The network had healed itself. In the final part, we will summarize our journey. We will look at the map one last time. We will review the key vocabulary: node, network, vector, corridor, hinterland. And we will ask the final question. In our modern world of airplanes and global supply chains, are we more safe than the people of 1347? Or are we just faster targets? We will close the book on the London Gritty Chronicles for today. The map of the world is never still. If you look at a digital map of global air traffic today, you will see thousands of tiny planes moving like fireflies. They are following invisible lines in the sky. These are the modern corridors. Instead of wind and oars, we use jet fuel. Instead of taking weeks to cross the Mediterranean, we take hours. But the principle remains exactly the same as it was in 1347. We are all connected by a web of movement. Let's retrace our journey one last time. We started in Caffa, on the edge of the Black Sea. We watched a biological weapon, Yersinia pestis, board a Genoese galley. We watched it travel along the network. A network is an arrangement of intersecting horizontal and vertical lines. In our story, the network was the trade routes that made Europe rich. We saw the ships arrive at the nodes. A node is a point at which lines or pathways intersect or branch, a central or connecting point. Messina, Genoa, Marseille. These were the nodes. They were the entry points where the infection stepped off the boat. We watched the disease move from the coast to the hinterland. The hinterland is the remote area behind a coast or a river's banks. The refugees fled inland, carrying the invisible enemy into the villages and farms. And we identified the vector. A vector is an organism, typically a biting insect or tick, that transmits a disease or parasite from one animal or plant to another. The rat was the vehicle. The flea was the vector. Finally, we saw how the disease transformed society. It broke the feudal system. It created a shortage of labor. It raised wages. It changed language. It forced cities to invent quarantine. History is not just a list of dates. It is a study of systems. When you understand the geography of 1347, you understand the geography of the modern world. Today, a virus can travel from a market in Asia to a skyscraper in New York in less than 24 hours. The velocity has changed, but the vulnerability is the same. Velocity is the speed of something in a given direction. In 1347, the velocity was the speed of a ship, 4 knots. Today, it is the speed of a Boeing 747, 500 knots. But there is one major difference. The people of 1347 were walking in the dark. They did not know what was killing them. They blamed the stars. They blamed the air. They blamed each other. We have the light of science. We have microscopes. We have antibiotics. We have data. Yet, looking back at the great mortality, we must respect the resilience of our ancestors. They watched half their world die, and they did not give up. They buried the dead. They planted the fields. They rebuilt the walls. They wrote new laws. They survived. This story is a reminder that humanity is fragile, but it is also incredibly tough. We are bound together by our need to trade, to travel, and to connect. And sometimes, that connection brings danger. But would we want to live on an isolated island, cut off from the world, just to be safe? Probably not. We crave the horizon. We are explorers by nature. So, the next time you see a ship docking at a harbor or a plane landing at an airport, remember the Genoese galleys of October 1347. Remember the power of the network. And remember that every connection is a risk, but it is also a bridge. Thank you for traveling with us on the London Gritty Chronicles. We have tracked the invisible killer across the map. We have learned the language of movement and survival. Keep watching the horizon.